So I'm hoping we can begin to have some of this discussion on this first panel this morning. And I want to invite Dan and Gita out. Thanks. I couldn't hear a thing when I was back there. So if you didn't hear, yeah, I was saying all sorts of horrible things about both of you. So there are going to be a lot of questions about that, I'm sure. So I was trying to talk about other places and just set a general stage for the scale of the problems. Dan, why don't we begin with you? So we're coming up to an anniversary on Sandy. How do you feel about how this city has done since then? I'm not just asking you what you've accomplished, but what are the kind of big challenges facing you in particular?
Great, thanks for having me. And yes, we did not hear how that was set up, so hopefully we're prepared for this. And great to be here. Thanks to MAS for having us and able to talk about this important topic. We're approaching the 5th anniversary of Hurricane Sandy at the end of this month. It's a major milestone in what we've been working toward in our recovery program, in our efforts to build long-term resiliency. And at the same time, we're in this context of Harvey and Irma and Maria and other big storms that are focusing attention, rightfully so, on the challenges that climate change is going to continue to bring to our urban areas. And so in 5 years, I think, we can certainly talk through the things that we've done, and you're looking at great examples like the Rockaway Boardwalk and coastal defenses that have been upgraded and building codes changed, and a lot of great progress has been made, but make no mistake, we have a lot more to do. The mayor talks about our efforts to prepare for and to mitigate the effects of climate change is something that's going to be with us for the rest of our lives. It's something that we're going to be working on for generations. And we need to make sure that we are dramatically reducing our greenhouse gas emissions to avoid the worst consequences that are coming our way. But the things that are important to me at this moment in taking stock is really how the conversation around climate change and our cities has changed since Hurricane Sandy, and the recognition that we need to work with communities and in communities, because that's where people live, that's where we live, work, and play, and that's where the investments have to make sense, have to be real, and have to make New Yorkers safer. And I've been proud of the way that we've not just engaged our communities in a pro forma way. We've had deliberative dialogue with communities in order to advance projects like the East Side Coastal Resiliency Project, like what we're doing in Red Hook, the things we're doing around Jamaica Bay and on Staten Island. Having deliberative dialogue with communities about what the real risks are, grounded in the best available science, and the recognition that we have dollars that we can actually bring to bear that come with different strings attached and different requirements and timeframes and things. But with all of that, we are moving forward and making New Yorkers safer. And we've had good success. We've had projects finished. We have great things we can point to. And at the same time, we have so much more to do that we're going to be at this for quite some time.
So Gita, how would you answer that question? How do you think we've fared since Sandy?
I mean, in lots of ways, I agree with Dan in that there has been quite a lot of effort, and I think over the past 5 years, New York City has seen a lot of movement forward, and maybe even been a leader in terms of sort of climate change and resilience rebuilding in comparison to the rest of the country. But at the same time, I live in Red Hook. I'm sort of helping to spear the sort of resiliency rebuilding there, and I also wear an architect's hat and a designer's hat, and I feel like there is just an incredible path to still go down. And so while I feel like there has been a lot of thinking and planning and thought process behind it and some implementation, a lot of it has sort of fallen short, and so there's a lot more that needs to be done. And I think grappling with the issues of how do we actually see action and implementation happen now that we've sort of come through over the past 5 years and understood what it looks like to recover at the level that we have now, but what does it look like to recover to a point where we feel like the climate change impact that's on our shores can be handled?
Well, let me ask you both. I mean, one of the things that I've learning as I go around and talk to people in different places is, for many people, it's a very cold cost-benefit question. For taxpayers, it is. For homeowners, it is. For politicians, it is. I'm interested in both of you answering how you see the cost benefits. So, is it, the cost benefits are obvious, right? But, if you move people out, what are the political costs? Are they just so insanely high that no one ever wants to risk them? But also, what are the costs of undertaking large infrastructural projects? Are people really, remember Cuomo immediately after Sandy said we have to build a Seagate, at the, I wasn't quite sure where it would be because I don't know how you hold back all the water, but essentially at the Verrazano, I guess.
Yeah.
Because that's the only way we can prevent this from happening again. And immediately people began to say, well, what would that cost? And how effective would it be? So, how do you both measure this issue of cost benefits, both on a community level and then on a large-scale city level?
I think that the costs, the funding has to be there, and the costs do have to play out, but at the same time, the cost-benefit analysis these days, they don't include all of the impacts and measures, so a true analysis is actually meaningful. And so when FEMA was doing their cost-benefit analysis to see if, the integrated flood protection system would work, a lot of the issues around social resilience and around environmental capital and around, sort of all the other issues besides just like hard sort of capital investment and, financial dollars, it's just not included. And so I actually think that our economic framework needs to change and absorb sort of a wider perspective in terms of how our cities are run and the value of these sort of...
What the benefits are, how you calculate them.
Yeah, exactly.
Do you agree with that, Dan?
Well, I think there's a lot to that, and even more so when you're dealing with the federal streams, they do encourage the concrete and steel solutions.
Yeah.
And they also negatively impact neighborhoods that incomes are lower and assets are lower because there's not enough to count in the benefits. Mm-hmm. Right. It doesn't encourage anything like redundancy because you get to count a benefit once. But in a larger sense, we know from what happened in Sandy as a $19 billion loss event here in New York City, and the modeling we've done of what climate change could do is that in the 2050s, just by changing the climate, that could be a $90 billion event. And so we know we can't afford to keep taking punches like that, which is why we're investing to buy down that risk. And we know that when we do buy down that risk, it does avoid future costs at multiples of what you're investing when you invest smartly.
Yep, but if we had another Sandy next month, I want to get later to exactly how far we've come, so be more specific. But if we had another Sandy again, I assume that we would still get hit with a pretty hefty bill. So, just walk us through a little bit this question of, let's say we had 5 years ago just said, fine, we're going to build a giant piece of infrastructure and spend $20 billion on it. Would that help us? Do you think that kind of thing, in other words, I think the three of us on the panel here, and probably a lot of people in the audience here, would automatically say, that's just a crazy idea.
Well,
but I think it's important to ask, when one's talking about cost benefits, if we're going to be hit by this again, people are going to say, what were you talking about? How here we are again with the same bill? Is there another approach that actually might yield another benefit?
Well, I think that a single solution is not what resiliency is all about. And so building a single Seagate wall is not the right way to go in terms of...
Why are you setting it up as an either-or?
Well, because if there are a finite amount of dollars, then I think we ought to be spending those dollars in a way that addresses multiple communities across multiple shorelines with multiple sort of methods, because it's not just about the integrated flood protection system or the seawalls, it's also about social resiliency, putting dollars into community.
I hear you, but you're accepting, and I think we all do automatically because that's just the world we live in, you're accepting that there is a limit to the amount of dollars. FEMA, I think, said, what is it, Dan? I forgot. Invest $1 now, save $4 later. So, there is an obvious economic argument. Why isn't the question, why don't we spend what it takes to do this because American taxpayers should not be left with a tab that's 4 and probably more times the amount of what we'll spend. Why are we all living in this where we're accepting the idea that it's either or?
Well, and I mean, it's not either or, but and yes, we should be spending absolutely what it takes, but then I think we also have to create those funding mechanisms. So for instance, like, creating taxes, like some type of tax infrastructure that might be able to offset that, creating, insurance offsets. So creating new funding mechanisms that can bring those dollars in is really important. And thus far, we don't have those in place. And maybe Dan can talk about, maybe they are on the table in the mayor's office, but they haven't been brought to the fore. I mean, even just getting FEMA to understand that mitigation credits are acceptable, right, would be one step in the right direction. And I do think that there are funding mechanisms that can make that happen, and these are long-term solutions that have to be put into place, right? It's not just one funding stream, 90 million, whatever, $90 billion at one point. These are funding streams that have to happen over a very long period of time, and it's long-term investment.
So obviously I'm asking you this question in the middle of an administration that is not, shall we say, been entirely forthcoming with funds yet, when we've had a series of calamities.
You mean in D.C.?
In D.C. So let me ask you this question.
I had to clarify that.
Yeah, sorry. Just a clarification, sorry, yes, in D.C. As a matter of fact, let me ask you then, how are you dealing with a changed, how does this affect New York, this changed federal city relationship, in terms of dollars as well as everything else?
Well, there's certainly a lot to be said there. First, I wanted to just hit the point from just a few minutes ago on the idea of infrastructure, and certainly we haven't shied away from the need for additional infrastructure, which is why we've been pushing forward on any number of flood defenses on the Lower East Side and in Red Hook and other places, because that plays a role, but that can't blind us to the need for more than just the infrastructure and the social capital and the social cohesion work that is really some of our frontline defense when bad things happen. And we're seeing that play out, of course, in Puerto Rico, and we're seeing that in Houston, and we saw that in Florida. So the need for infrastructure is a critical part of that, and we are investing to do that. And in many cases, we're doing that with federal dollars that we've been able to lock in from the Sandy recovery that we're still spending. And so those are protected dollars. Those are in grant agreements and things. And so we don't really see that as a big risk at this point. We have to meet our deadlines, and we're on track to do that. But what it might mean for the future, of course, is real. And the Trump administration is putting its head in the sand on climate change for sure, and what that might mean for the need to advance additional sea level rise protections or other things that we need federal participation with.
So what, if you went to the Trump administration now and said, these are our priorities and this is what they would cost, the big ones, what would you be telling them right now? What are your main priorities, and what would the argument be if you tried to ask for money from the feds at this point?
Oh, one of the biggest ones is continued and expanded partnership with the Army Corps of Engineers on new infrastructure in and around the harbor. That's a big need, and maybe there's bipartisan support for things like that.
Like what kind of interest? Be specific with people here. Like what would you wake up in the morning, you're given a check, what are you going to spend it on? What's your first?
Oh, now I wish I had pulled out my wish list. There are plenty of communities that continue to be vulnerable, and we are working to reduce those vulnerabilities, but that might mean in and around Jamaica Bay and actually funding the investments that the Army Corps has been committed to, but is not fully funded for. That is a big one, and that's a top priority. But there's plenty of other things as well.
Why should people continue to live in Jamaica Bay?
People do live in Jamaica Bay.
Yeah,
and if we would go back 300 years and say, where should we develop, that's one set of questions. Those questions were answered, and people are in particular areas, and we want to make sure that they remain safe. That doesn't mean we're not thinking about other options, and we've done some targeted acquisitions, and I know the state's done some buyouts and things like that. But there's a long-term glide path to some of those larger, harder decisions that we need to continue to work through. But at the same time, the vulnerabilities exist now, and there are things we can do about it, which is why we've raised streets in Broad Channel and improved the drainage system and eliminated flooding conditions that exist on a monthly basis now. Those are things we have to do, but that doesn't preclude larger, bigger conversations on what the future may hold.
On relocation and so forth, something like this.
Yeah, I think that these are long term questions, right? And so I think that what Dan is saying, like, there are people that are living in certain locations now that have immediate issues, right? So hurricane season's almost over, thank goodness. We haven't been hit yet, but you know, every year we're still vulnerable. But at the same time, there are longer term issues that we have to address with maybe retreat or repositioning. But at the same time, I think that those conversations need to happen within the communities, and those communities need to be supported going through those types of discussions and planning processes. And almost every community needs to go through that. And whether or not you're in a low-lying area or you're not, and I do feel like, so Red Hook went through a New York Rising community planning process, which didn't actually do a complete holistic sort of resiliency plan, but did offer the venue and the mechanism for having some of those conversations. And that was really valuable, and I do think that our community, I would like to see us go through another round of sort of resiliency holistic planning. So right now there's some neighborhoods that are going through like rezoning, right, sort of discussions or planning processes. I'm not really interested in just looking at rezoning, but I'm interested in looking at communities going through holistic resiliency planning processes. And I think then those are the opportunities for really having those discussions around whether or not it's a viable place to live over the course of 50 or 100 years. Yeah. So you're not threatening people's homes immediately, right? But you're looking at, is it realistic for their grandchildren to be living in that house, right? And putting the cards on the table in terms of what the realities are for climate change. I think these discussions have to happen over a period of time, and we can't just sort of yank the sort of fabric out from under people's feet, and then figure out what is the appropriate plan. So, you know, Oakwood and Staten Island, you know, like the communities can start to decide for themselves with the help of sort of, you know, city support to make that happen.
And if I could add to that, I think building on what's actually happened in communities and how the dialogue has advanced, one of the biggest innovations that we had after Hurricane Sandy is not just focusing on what another Sandy might do, although some do that, but really what's the wider range of risks that do face us. And heat waves kill more New Yorkers than any other natural hazard. The long-term existential risk from sea level rise alone, putting aside storms, is real. And dealing with all that, and I've been heartened by the conversations we have in communities that people on the ground get it, sometimes more so than, you know, the others that aren't in the communities on a regular basis. There's many things that threaten our city. The mayor has put forward our own strategic plan, One NYC, looking at how you know, the management of growth, how we deal with increasing inequality, our transportation infrastructure, and yes, climate change on top of that. We have to think of these things holistically, and I think communities get it more than anybody when we go in to have those conversations. So it's hard to just pull one thing out and say, hurricane happened, how are we doing on hurricane? That's an important piece of it, but that's only one piece of it.
Right, I mean, the hurricane was in planning, we talk about shocks and stresses, right? And the hurricane was a shock, and then it actually brought to light all of these stresses, right? And then, so now I feel like it's been sort of in the aftermath. The year after Sandy was sort of dealing with the shock of it, and now over the past 5 years, it's dealing with the stresses, and then over, I feel like, the next 5 to 15 to 20 years, how do we deal with sort of making sure that those stresses are relieved?
I mean, I think I hope everyone here agrees with you that this idea of engagement with the community and getting the community to come along and understand the benefits for themselves in thinking through these problems is obviously an essential strategy. And by the way, I think, so I was just mentioning that I was in Houston, and they've had so far 3,000 requests for buyouts since Harvey, which was late August, and there have been 3,000 buyouts since 1994. So obviously there is a growing awareness among people that they you know, are willing to move and to change their lives if they see that a situation has changed and they don't want to put up with it anymore. But I guess I keep coming back to this provocation because I think the balance between sort of consensus and science is a hard one to strike because it's always played out on a political level. And the politics are so complicated and people's memories tend to be so short. You're looking skeptical.
Not about what you're saying, I guess I'm thinking about other things. But where it's leading me to think is the need to institutionalize this work, and that plays out in a couple different ways. And one is the need to set up long-term acquisition programs just for repetitive flood locations, and whether that's in the city or in the wider region. And like there are places to do that. Changing our zoning codes, changing our building codes. We need to. It's hard to think about these challenges in the one-off project basis, and we need to build it more into our DNA. And how we do that is building it into how we develop and fund and build projects. And that means the building code and the zoning code and the ways in which we think about things that don't require you to think about it on every single occasion. It just starts to bake into and institutionalize what we do. I bring that up because the acquisition programs are a key part of that, of having a funding stream. Maybe I should put this on the wish list for DC, but having a regularly just stood up program for that repetitive loss type property, which there are plenty of in the region, that we need to deal with or are going to continue to drain the taxpayer dollars, where we may be able to spend those dollars in a better way.
Let me just ask, sorry, Gita.
I do think that there are so those of us that went through Hurricane, Superstorm Sandy, felt the impacts, dealt with it, it is in our memory. And at the same time, there's a large swath of the city that didn't feel the impacts, right? And so then the question is, I feel like I talk to people all the time that are really, A, unaware, B, they live in some part of high ground, so they don't think that anything is going to happen to them. But to me, this is a citywide issue, right? And so in Red Hook, we had a nursing home that wanted to come and put themselves with hundreds of, not just elderly, but like at the end of their life elderly into our community. And our community fought hard, not because we are against nursing homes, right? I mean, we all have elderly family that wants to live close by, and I think that's very important. But at the same time, we struggled with elderly surviving the hurricane, right? And it was a real big issue for us in terms of providing support services to people that were on the 17th floor. So we fought hard, we won, the city councilman heard us, helped us prevent that from happening. But I was just shocked that they would even want to put a nursing home in a hurricane flood zone, right? That was even an option. And so I feel like—
Who's the they?
The nursing home, right? The developer.
The developers of the nursing home.
Right? I mean, it just seems like that's one of the most inappropriate places to put a group of elderly people that need, a huge amount of support services in the event of an emergency. And so in that case, it is sort of always surprising when you're sort of boots on the ground how real it is that there is a lack of understanding and a lack of memory. And so
did they end up there?
No, because the community fought, right, to prevent.
Where'd they end up?
Well, they will figure it out.
Okay.
Right? But ideally on higher ground, and if they wanted to be close to Red Hook, fine. They can be literally 10 blocks up, and they would be out of the flood zone.
It's the breakfast at IKEA that everyone wants to be near.
But I think the point is that like our zoning codes, like Dan said, like there is still a lot of work to be done to address these kinds of issues.
Yeah.
And the memory is short, is particularly by those that haven't experienced it, sort of firsthand.
Memory's short anyway. I mean, people just want to move on and get their lives back to normal. And there's a certain period of time when you have momentum after an event, and then the political and other will just sort of dies out. You were about to say something, but I want to ask you a quick question. One of the issues that came up after Sandy was getting the government, that now we're talking about your government, city government, to work, to play better interagency-wise. Because, it's traditionally, like so many governments, a fairly siloed system. So I know you think that that's getting better, and can you give us some examples of ways it has worked, and maybe a couple of places where it has not worked as well yet?
And you mean how we work together as a city across the country?
You and then people do housing and transit and so forth.
Well, I think there's a lot of great examples, and maybe that the One NYC program is a great example of that, of bringing together a number of different programs that are being pushed forward by agencies, and putting that umbrella strategy on top of it has helped bring things together.
Like?
So just in this context, the way that we are moving forward our climate programs and our response to Hurricane Sandy and bringing an equity focus into that has actually changed how we engage with communities, and the types of things that we're doing in Red Hook, in Hunts Point, on the Lower East Side, bringing more voices into that process, I think is a big win, and bringing more agencies into that process as well to make sure that the projects we develop work for our agencies, yes, work for communities, yes, and still meet the needs of what we're trying to accomplish of risk reduction and not just building infrastructure that is, one-time use every 100 years or something, but it's, a daily amenity. The Rockaway Boardwalk is a fantastic example of that, of a daily amenity that provides protection. The Lower East Side is being developed exactly with that in mind through the ESCR project. So I think those are helpful examples.
Yeah.
And then a separate topic and example is the threats of heat that we face.
Yeah.
And working together with our health department and targeting over $100 million in a new announcement this summer towards the most heat-vulnerable neighborhoods with street tree plantings that are undertaken by our Parks Department, with roof coatings that are being done by our Small Businesses Agency, and moving all of that towards the goal of how do we address the urban heat island effect and mitigate the public health impacts of rising heat in New York City, I think are great examples of how we're doing that.
Yes and no. I mean, I think that there is sort of this overarching great sort of city push for sort of towards climate change, but when it comes to sort of on the ground city agency interaction and interrelation, it's not working. And so we have, and I don't know how we sort of get what's happening in the mayor's office to actually filter down through all of those agencies, and maybe it has to be like roundtable events where various different agencies are at the table in each community talking about their projects. But we have found that when a project is sort of brought to a community or to our community, like Parks Department redoing Coffey Park, or the ball fields being renovated for lead poisoning, that they're not actually understanding resiliency holistically within the community, and they're not really talking to other agencies to understand what other projects are happening in parallel, to understand how they may be able to integrate with each other. And to me, that's a cost savings, right? And so it's able, instead of putting in all new streets and then saying, oh, by the way, we want a community microgrid, let's dig up the streets and put in piping for that. Let's just do it all at once.
Yeah.
And I think that there could be mechanisms so that way those agencies have the opportunity to be able to talk to each other.
I mean, I'll just throw out there, the subway system, which is not, obviously, well, according to Governor Cuomo, it is the mayor's problem. But, here you have, it's not just a city issue, it's a city and state issue. You have a highly dysfunctional organization with enormous stresses every day. So much of the cost of Sandy and the damage done by Sandy was about affecting the subways. It's hard to know how much farther they have come since then. And when I was thinking if Sandy happened next week, I was thinking the subways, how much better would the subways fare? I think they would fare somewhat better, but not nearly enough. I'm so glad you brought up heat, because I remember Eric Kleinenberg's book, my friend Eric's book, which was really so interesting about pointing out how in Chicago, where there was this huge heat wave in the mid-90s, Chicago and many people died, and especially in areas where we did not have social resilience, and so people didn't know where to go. Afterwards, Chicagoans were asked how many people had died, and to almost all of them answered with a number that was a tiny fraction of the actual disaster. And why that's so interesting to me is this question of memory, and especially when something like heat, which is invisible but as much a climate issue, happens, there's a way in which we just don't retain, as it were, the memory of what these disasters really mean. So they get worse as time goes on. I want to say one last thing along these lines too, just to ask you quickly. I thought some of you, when you're talking about heat and other things, would talk about some of the architectural and as well benefits that can accrue. So, for instance, libraries turned out to be such an interesting place in Red Hook and elsewhere. They were places where people went. They're places that are cooling centers. They're places that are serving many different kinds of functions. I wonder if any of you either of you have been thinking about how sort of building structures and typologies that are, sort of part of the city landscape need to be integrated into these sort of strategies.
Yeah, so I'm actually working with Alex Mazuski at the Brooklyn Public Library system to really look at how the Brooklyn Public Library system can function from a much more sort of environmental community perspective. I think that the nice thing about some of these networks of buildings is that you can actually have a really big impact because the Brooklyn Public Library has 52 buildings, right? And so if you look at the impact that you could have by creating sort of environmental community centers around these sort of places that already exist as centers, then I think it can have a really sort of serious, sort of borough-wide kind of impact on them. And there are proponents of that, right?
Yeah. Well, it's about integrating things. It's about interagency, so you have not exactly the same agency. There isn't even a Department of Libraries, but that idea.
Right.
Anything to add, Dan? I see we've run out of time.
No, I mean, I like those ideas, and libraries do serve a lot of that function already, and are the cooling centers and other places where kids go and families, and it's a gathering point, and that's really important in communities. And I think we need more of that. And
but public schools can act like that also.
Absolutely, and the Community Schools Initiative, I think, is a big piece of that. But then even broadening, this answer a bit on what can we do on the built form about resiliency. I would want to point people to the work that our city planning department has done on resilient neighborhoods and taking 10 different neighborhoods, looking at the public form and the zoning and the land use of how that can be a greater tool for citywide resiliency. And it's been, I think, phenomenally successful looking at a number of different areas and pushing forward with smart zoning that can support this effort.
Yeah, I wish we had more time, but I wanted to thank you both.
Great, thank you.
Thank you.